Is this on? Working? Good. It's all right. All right. There's this guy I know who has a tendency to overwork himself to please others. He's also so focused and concerned about what people think of him. But on the flip side, he has great compassion and consideration for other people. He loves being around people and he enjoys talking with them and having just being around people. But when it comes to social gatherings, he struggles. He becomes so frozen and nervous and anxious. And in those interactions, he becomes grossly entangled into a web of thoughts, unable to flee his feelings of anxiousness. And through repetition, he developed these narrow pathways in his mind that caused him to think less of himself. And he was so focused on his anxiety that this caused him to develop depression. This is a story of a guy who solely focused on anxiety. He didn't realize there were so many other things out there that he can look at positively. But he focuses on all the negative things that he struggled with. And so what I'm going to talk about is neuroplasticity. How can we get this guy out of feeling anxiety? And so before I go into that, I'm going to briefly talk about neurons so that we have a basic understanding of what neurons are. So neurons are nerve cells within our brain, and they're responsible for sending signals to our motor commands so we can move our muscles, move our hands, however. Nerve cells are also responsible for receiving sensory input from our external environment. So this means that we can see, touch, feel. We register everything through our neurons in our brain. And so we're able to comprehend whatever it is we're doing in our world through neurons. We have 86 billion neurons within our brain. That is a huge amount of neurons. And so how do these neurons work? Simply said, there's one neuron on one side, a neuron on another side, and between it is an area called the synapses. So one neuron will send out a neurotransmitter. This can be dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin. There's 100 different neurotransmitters that are sent through this area called the synapses. When it sends it out, there's a receiving neuron that will take that neurotransmitter and send a signal right back to the original neuron. That is how a neural pathway is formed. And I find that fascinating because did you guys know that at the age of 25, we stop developing our brain? But that does not mean we stop growing and changing our brain. Our brain is continually growing. We're learning and adapting in our environment. We're continually seeing everything and just growing in our brain. Did you guys know that for every new thought that you have, you develop a new neural pathway? And I find that fascinating. For every new thought, whatever new thought that you have, a new neural pathway is developed. And so the term for, I don't know if you guys heard of the term neurons that fire together, wire together. So basically, if we go back to that neural pathway, neurons are firing back and forth with each other. They're communicating with each other. That's a neural pathway. And so the more we use that neural pathway, the stronger it becomes. The less we use that neural pathway, the weaker it becomes. And so going back to this guy that I know, he struggled with anxiety. He was so focused on his anxiety that that's all he thought about. And he developed those neural pathways that were strong. And then those neural pathways became so automatic that whenever he interacted with someone, all this anxiety came up and he was unable to get out of that anxiety. And so he struggled with it. And so how do we rewire his brain? We got to help him focus on the positive. He didn't realize it, but there are so many positive things that he had going on with him. But he solely focused on the negative. That's what our brain does. We are meant to survive. And we focus on the negative because we want to fix whatever problem it is that we are trying to get rid of. And the more we focus on that problem, the more it becomes worse. And so what we need to do with him is just simply acknowledge those thoughts. Take some time to talk with a therapist or talk with someone else and trying to understand, why are you thinking those negative thoughts? Once you can acknowledge those negative thoughts, you're able to just acknowledge it and let it sit there. Don't try to push them away. The more you try to push those negative thoughts away, they're going to be worse. The more that you try to focus on those negative thoughts, they're going to be worse. Because if there's anything true about neural pathways, the more we focus on something, the stronger it becomes. And so now we need to focus on positivity. I'm not talking about positive affirmation. I'm not talking about positive thinking. I'm talking about positive interactions for this guy. Say, for instance, he goes to a coffee shop. He had a wonderful conversation with a person at the coffee shop, but he's not thinking about that. He's thinking about all the bad stuff that's happened to him at that coffee shop. Maybe all the weird looks that he had or anything that he focused on. He didn't focus on, I had just this great conversation. We talked about whatever it was, baseball or football. But he just want to focus on that negative. And so in order for him to get out of that, you got to focus on positive things. Because if you focus on the positive, those neural pathways will develop stronger and stronger. And when you focus on simply that, it'll be easier and easier. And so when we don't focus on that negative stuff, those neurons, those neural pathways become weaker and weaker and weaker. And if we don't push them away, if we try to push them away, we'll focus on them. But if we just let them sit there, they'll become weaker and weaker. And so I'll leave you with this one thought. It's not experience what happens to us. It's how we interpret what happens to us. So let me say that again. It's not what experience happens to us. It's how we interpret what happens to us.